you again for that. That was really interesting. And we'll hand now to Louise, who has patiently waited all day to tell us about the excavation at St James's, Euston.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, that was a tough act to follow there, Guy. It's such a fascinating site. But yeah, I'm here to talk about the excavations at St James's Gardens, which are at the southern terminal for HS2. And I'm a post-excavation manager at MOLA, so I'm managing the reporting process, which is starting now, or we're in the middle of. So Nigel, if I could have the next slide, please. We'll get started. So the site is just immediately to the west of Euston Station. You can see it here. So in this photo, north is to the left, and you've got Hampstead Road running along the bottom of the screen there, and Euston Road is in the background. And since 2016, we've had a team of over 100 archaeologists and specialists from MOLA Headland Infrastructure on site, initially on behalf of Costain Skanska joint venture for HS2. And we've now recorded over 11,000 18th and 19th century burials from the site. It's the largest excavation of burials of this date that's ever been undertaken in the UK, but I'd say bigger isn't always better necessarily. It's been a huge undertaking for all of us though, involving a large team both on and off site. So sites, like lots of the sites today, is of course a burial ground. So I'll let you know now that I do have some images of human remains in this presentation, but I'll let you know when those are coming up. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay. So the site was established as an additional burial ground for the parish of St James's in Piccadilly in 1788. And at that time, the parish authorities were struggling to accommodate all of their dead. And so they chose a site in the fields on the way to Hampstead, north of London. And you can see it here on the left on the Roke map of 1746. So this is a few years before the burial ground was established, but it gives you quite a good idea of just how rural that location kind of was still at the time. And apart from the churchyard in Piccadilly, which was mainly reserved for the wealthier members of the parish, there were also two grounds at Marshall Street and Poland Street in Soho, which were used for burials, but they were pretty full by the later 18th century. And interestingly, we've actually excavated those burial grounds at MOLA as well, so they're kind of coming up for publication soon, and they're a really important assemblage for comparison to St James's Gardens. On the right here, you can see a plan of the parish in 1770, and you might notice it's got some very fashionable streets in it, which are still kind of wealthy areas today, but it wasn't always exclusively wealthy, and the areas kind of around the northern and eastern parts of the parish around Soho were poor, much poorer in the 18th and 19th centuries. And sort of Regent Street is kind of roughly a dividing line between the wealthier and the poorer parts of the parish. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So the ground at Hampstead Road catered for everyone in the parish, whether they were rich or poor. And it also received burials from other people who lived locally, but not within this parish of St James's. The first burials happened towards the end of 1789, and work started building the chapel in 1791. The chapel itself survived until 1964, when the crypt was cleared of burials and the above ground parts of the building were demolished. So our parish registers, which we do have, we're really lucky to have such a kind of incredibly detailed registers of all the burials. They suggest that as many as 61,000 burials were made in the ground before it closed in 1853. And that was as a result direct result of the 1852 Metropolitan Burials Act, which gave the government special powers to close overcrowded and insanitary burial grounds in London. Next slide, please. So it's kind of interesting to note, given the context of our work as well, I guess, that the parish authorities always took, or in the 19th century, took quite a pragmatic approach when it came to thinking about needing to move the remains of the dead. So St James's Gardens is actually located within the parish of St Pancras, and in the 1860s, St Pancras proposed to purchase the chapel and the burial ground from St James's for £1,000. And they had quite a canny surveyor working for St James's at the time, and he said that he didn't think that £1,000 was enough money for the burial ground, which was out of use by the state, because in his view the land was going to increase in value because it was right next to Euston station, which had opened initially in 1837. And his prediction that the land would eventually be absorbed into the station here came partially true a few years later, when in 1887 the station was expanded to the west to incorporate the eastern part of the burial ground. So you can see on this slide, it's a different shape. It's kind of lost the northeast corner. And those burials that were in that area, we believe they were moved to Finchley Cemetery, which is now known as St Pancras and Islington Cemetery. Next slide, please. At the same time as Euston was expanded, the ground was turned into a public gardens, and a lot of the burial monuments, the gravestones, were moved around to the edges of the gardens, and some of them were buried in situ. Others were left standing. So on the right here, there's a monument to the members of the Christie family, which was a Grade 2 listed monument within the grounds, which we had to deal with as part of the excavations. This is the same Christie family that started the auction house, and they're amongst a great many historical figures who were buried in the ground. And the site stayed a public garden until HS2 took occupation of it. Next slide. So really big groups of closely dated burials like those from St James's Gardens are such an important resource for research on burial practice and osteology. But I think it's worth noting here as well that they also give us a really unique opportunity to kind of remember people who lived before us and to think about their lives. Everyone on the team has worked really hard throughout the project to maintain care, dignity, and respect for the dead at all times during our work. And you can see up on the top left here, the enormous tents. Well, it's not really a tent, temporary structure. It was really substantial and impressive building, effectively, that was built over the ground to enable the excavation work to take place. And I think with such a large number of burial grounds, it's especially important for us to try and strike a balance between looking at these really big data sets that we've generated through our recording work and trying to understand, the individuals and the people who were buried in the ground. And we've got a lot of documentary sources that we can go to for this period. And I should say a special mention here to Robert Hartle, who worked on site throughout the excavations and has been doing enormous amounts of research into the people who were buried within the ground, which has been really invaluable to all of us and to the talk today as well. Next slide. So we've got 11,000 archaeologically excavated burials, and those are a sample of the buried population from St James's Gardens. Following desk-based research and trial trenching carried out before the main phase of excavation, it was estimated that between 30,000 and the full 61,000 burials might survive on the site. So we worked to develop a sampling strategy so that we had a good data set to work with. The plan on the left here shows all of the archaeologically excavated burials, together with the breastplates and memorials and gravestones, as well as the remains of the crypt, which survived beneath the chapel. You can see it here on the right. Next slide. Although the ground took burials of everyone from the parish, regardless of their social status, there was still some spatial segregation within the ground between the richer and poorer burials. The ground was divided into 4 sections or grounds. The first ground, which they're kind of, I can't do my cursor, but this is a plan of drainage in the burial grounds, and the drainage system sort of follows the lines of those 4 grounds. And the one nearest the chapel was known as the first ground and was used mainly by the upper classes. The second ground immediately to the east was used generally by the middle classes. The third ground beyond that was for the lower classes, and then the fourth ground at the easternmost side of the site was used by the poor, and also for paupers who were buried at the expense of the parish. And I'd say, those boundaries weren't necessarily strictly maintained, and it will be really interesting to sort of understand how all of this system worked in practice as we move into later stages of the analysis work. Next slide, please. So this plan here shows the burials that we excavated within the grounds, and you can see that they become generally more crowded with burials as we move towards the east. There's also some suggestion of a preference in the second and third grounds to be buried as close as possible to the western side of the ground and the chapel. The parish records show that the grounds were also shifted over time. So this is how they were originally laid out, but over time the fourth ground became quite full, and so the parish authorities decided to close the fourth ground, to turn the first ground, to split it down the middle and turn it into a new first and new second ground, and then the old second ground became third ground, and the third ground became fourth ground. So we've got different things going on over time with the burials and where they're being accommodated. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, okay, so more here on that sampling strategy that I was talking about. We developed this in collaboration with osteologists and other specialists and stakeholders with the aim of creating a really good, statistically robust data set which we could use for research. So this meant that burials in the outer parts of the ground, which are shown here in blue, were removed by the exhumation contractor, TCS, under an archaeological watching brief. And during this, the archaeologists and on-site osteologists were able to identify any burials of particular interest for further study. And those burials were excavated and retained for further recording by the osteology team. Next slide. Okay, so from now on, there'll be some burials. Next slide. In the central site, part of the site, all of the burials were archaeologically excavated unless they were deemed not to be in a suitable condition for this. So we had, for example, some burials that were in sealed lead coffins, which went straight for reburial. The burials in the central part of the ground were assigned to 2 categories based on their location. So in the orange hatched areas here, we excavated and retained all of the burials for further recording by the osteologists. And in the other areas, the burials were excavated. They were rapidly assessed by an osteologist on site, and then passed straight to the exhumation contractor for reburial. And in those areas as well, we still had the potential to identify any burials that were of particular interest, to retain them for more recording. So in total, we've retained approximately 4,700 burials from the site, and the other burials have been reburied at Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey. Next slide. Okay. So Guy's already spoken a bit about the system that was set up on site at Stoke Mandeville for processing human remains, and we had a very similar approach at Euston. All of the processing and osteological assessment recording of the skeletons took place in purpose-built accommodation on site, which CSJV worked really closely with the osteologists and the site team and the processing team to develop that and make sure that it was, working really well for them. And other kind of things that we were able to do because of the scale of the excavation were trialing a digital recording system using iPads on site, which we started off with as a pilot study in some of the trial trenches, and then rolled out across the excavation. And that's worked brilliantly well, actually. And we're continuing to develop kind of tablet-based recording systems at MOLA for new sites too. But this is where it started for us, at least. And we also recruited a team of 11 early career osteologists, or ECHOs as they were known, who were trained by our team of senior osteologists led by Mike Henderson. As well as participating in that training programme, they were able to provide support and feedback to archaeologists excavating burials and help the team carry out the initial recording work. Next slide, please. Okay. So we know the human remains from the site have so much potential to tell us about population, health, disease, diet, migration, and living conditions in late 18th and 19th century London. As we expected, Mike and his team have collected a really huge data set. And so just here are a few of, a very small number of some of the pathologies that they've recorded, including a cleft palate on the top left, a healed amputation below, some possible gallstones, evidence for tuberculosis of the spine, and a dental prosthesis on the right there. We've got quite a few dental prostheses, I guess would be the plural. We've also been looking or working with Oxford University to look at evidence for gastrointestinal parasites, which can provide information on migration and trade links, and with Dr. Sarah Inskip at Leicester University, who's leading a research project on the use of tobacco. Next slide, please. So the site is exceptional, not just because of how big it is, because it's huge, but also because of the level of preservation. When the ground was in use, it was known to be quite wet, and that was considered a problem. And the parish authorities put considerable efforts into installing that drainage system that I showed you earlier. But what this means for us now is that there are some areas of the ground that weren't quite so well drained. And in those areas, wooden coffins and finds made of textile and leather all survived really well. We've also got a large assemblage of coffin furniture, including breastplates and grips, and quite a lot of objects associated, buried with individuals as well. Yeah, lots of different things. Next slide, please. Okay. So we know that during the time the burial ground was in use, there was a really widespread and justified fear of body snatchers or resurrection men who would steal freshly buried corpses for sale to anatomy schools. This is a time when the medical profession was growing rapidly and more cadavers were needed for teaching. But until 1832, there was no legal supply of bodies for dissection other than those of executed criminals. So lots of burial grounds in London were targeted by the resurrection men, and people who were particularly fearful and who could afford it went to great lengths to protect remains from theft. There are several people at St James's Gardens who were buried in anti-resurrectionist coffins, which used design features like straps, metalwork, and extra secure joints to deter resurrectionists. The coffin here belonged to John Cayley, who was buried in the third ground in 1799, in a coffin that was designed to thwart any attempts at disinterment. It's similar to a design that was patented by Gabriel Orty in 1796, and it used special pins to close the lid, which couldn't be easily taken out again once they'd been installed. Next slide. The sites also produced this incredible assemblage of burial textiles. It's the most diverse and interesting one we've ever excavated. We've got pieces of clothing, ribbons, there's a satin bonnet here, and a pair of slippers. And we've also got several burials which included the remains of floral tributes with plants including bay, box, and rose stems. Next slide. Those slippers were particularly interesting. They were found with a man called William Page, who died in 1825. His memorial records that he'd worked in the civil service of the East India Company in Bombay. And at first it was thought that he might have brought the slippers back from India, because the specialist who was working with the textiles, Hilary Davidson, thought that they weren't like any other European shoes that she'd seen before. But she now has changed her mind, and she thinks that it's possible that they're a rare example of something called list slippers, which were a kind of house slipper that were made by weaving together the selvages of woolen cloth. Jane Austen, we know, had a pair of these, and they would be worn when you wanted something that was really quiet and comfortable. Next slide, please. Ooh, you've gone back instead of forward. That's the one. That's the one. So being able to identify burials like this is really important for us, because it allows us to link osteological and archaeological data with other historical sources. And it also provides information that can be used for checking osteological interpretations. We identified William Page from his coffin breastplate, which carried his name, date of death, and age. And this is the most precise way that we've got of identifying burials. We've got over 1,700 breastplates from the excavations, but it's like not all of them are legible, and not all of them necessarily relate to people who we excavated. And it's some of the burials even had two breastplates, one on an inner coffin and one on the outer coffin. And that's the case with William Page. He's got two. This is the second one. Next slide. Another really significant burial from the site, who was identified through his breastplate, was that of Captain Matthew Flinders. We knew that he was buried in the ground, but when the team on site actually identified his burial and found his breastplate, there was an awful lot of excitement, followed by media interest from around the world. Flinders undertook the first circumnavigation of Australia on the HMS Investigator in 1802-3, and also helped to promote the use of the name of Australia for the continent rather than New Holland. He was accompanied on that voyage by an Aboriginal man called Bungaree, who played a central role in the success of the expedition with his local knowledge and communicating with groups of Indigenous people. On his way back to Britain, Flinders was held prisoner by the French on the island of Mauritius for 6.5 years, and he finally made it back in 1810, only to die 4 years later, still only 40 years old, and just one day after his book and maps of Australia were finally published. I think Flinders and Page are both reminders for us that at the time the burial ground was in use, London was at the heart of an empire that was, stretched right around the globe and was growing. And there were lots of people who moved great distances as a consequence of this. One of HS2's research objectives for the site, along with the other HS2 burial grounds, is to develop sampling strategies to explore mobility within 18th and 19th century urban and rural populations. And this is something that we really hope to be able to explore much further at analysis. Next slide, please. So we know that people who were buried within the ground moved for lots of different reasons. And this is a community engagement project that we worked on alongside the excavation. We worked with a group of volunteers from the Dragon Hall Trust in Camden and an artist, Priya Sundram, and Rob Hartle was pretty involved with this as well, to research the stories of just a few people who were buried within the ground and put together their life story maps. And some of the individuals who were selected by the group included Elizabeth Montgomery, who came from a wealthy Irish family, but she died in Dieppe in France in 1833 and was brought back to London to be buried alongside her husband. Interestingly, her will mentions her collection of miniatures, and her burial included a portrait miniature on the right here, which I guess may have belonged to her in life. Another burial with a French connection was that of Irene Victoire Soyer, a French woman who was living on Rupert Street in Soho when she died in 1838. And she was commemorated by a gravestone that was erected by her friends in London and written partly in French. Next slide. Okay, so after the breastplates, it's the gravestones and the ledgers which have also helped to identify some of the burials. When the ground became a public garden, lots of the gravestones were moved to the edges of the site, but the ones that are still in situ in their original locations are very useful for us. And in combination with information from the breastplates and also the osteological data, they can help us to identify some of the burials. Next slide. Third way that we've got of trying to identify the burials are the burial registers, and these are a bit more complicated. They contain detailed lists of those who were buried in the ground, including names, ages, dates, the streets where people lived, or if within the parish, or the parish if not, and the location of the burial within the ground. Sometimes they also record the cause of death too, so they're an incredibly detailed resource. So each of the 4 grounds was divided up on a grid system into lots and plots. So we know kind of where people should have been buried within the ground from the registers. And it's a really important resource because unlike the breastplates and the ledger stones, which are biased towards some of the wealthier burials in the ground, the registers cover most of the burials which were made. Rob's been doing some initial work comparing known burials from the breastplates and ledger stones with the registers, and it's suggesting that they're not always completely accurate, but they're usually within a couple of squares of where they should be, if that makes sense. So we're very hopeful that in combination with osteological evidence, we'll be able to identify more burials than we currently have identified from the breastplates and the ledgers. Next slide, please. Okay. So someone that illustrates this problem, I guess, really, that we haven't been able to identify within the ground, but we think may be buried somewhere in the fourth ground, is the boxer Bill Richmond, who was born into slavery in Staten Island in New York. He came to Britain with Earl Percy as a teenager, and was set up with an apprenticeship as a cabinet maker in York. He's a really fascinating figure. He married a local woman, and they moved to London, perhaps because it would have been easier with London's more diverse population for them to live in the city. He became a celebrated pugilist, and this is at a time when boxing was a really fashionable hobby for the upper classes. So in his boxing academy, he taught men including Lord Byron and William Hazlitt. And he was also the landlord of a pub near Leicester Square called the Horse and Dolphin. But in spite of all of this incredible life story, he died in poverty. And we know that he was buried within the parish, but his name is missing from the burial registers, which might suggest that he was buried as a pauper, as the registers for the pauper burials haven't survived for the year that he died. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the last one. So to finish up, I'm ending with a bit of a plea. If you're interested in the work that we've been doing and you can read 18th and 19th century handwriting, or you'd like to try, or you know someone who would, we're still recruiting volunteers to help us with transcribing the burial records using the online citizen science platform Zooniverse. We've got about 1,400 volunteers who've been doing an amazing job so far, but we're still only about 15% of the way through all of the records. So there's a lot more to be done, and we really value any time that anyone is able to give to the project. And personally, I have a very special plea, if you do have a go, to work on the workflow that has the burial lots and plots, because that's the one that really helps us kind of link everything together. So yeah, that's it. That's the end of the talk. Thank you very much. Next slide is the end. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was fantastic.